The truth behind the gesture that made the king of country cry in public for the first time in 40 years. The fluorescent lights of luxury motors. San Antonio cast harsh shadows across Sarah Miller's pale face as she gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, fighting back a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. At 32 years old, she looked like a woman who had aged a decade in just 12 months. The double dose of pain medication she had taken that morning was wearing off, and the familiar burning sensation in her chest reminded her that her body was fighting a war she wasn't sure she could win. Sarah adjusted her navy blazer for the third time in 10 minutes, hoping to hide the weight loss that had become impossible to conceal. 3 months into her new job at the prestigious dealership, she had managed to keep her secret from her colleagues. Cancer. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, even though she had been living with the diagnosis for over a year. Stage 2 breast cancer, the doctors had said. Treatable but aggressive. What they hadn't mentioned was how it would feel to smile at customers while your body screamed in pain, or how difficult it would be to explain frequent absences to a new employer who had already shown little patience for her occasional tardiness. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. Sarah had dropped off her 2 children, Emma and Michael, ages 8 and 10, at their respective schools, promising them she would pick up groceries after work for Emma's birthday dinner that weekend. The promise felt heavy in her chest, not because of the expense, though money was tighter than ever, but because she wasn't sure she would have the energy to cook after another round of chemotherapy scheduled for Thursday. Her old Honda Civic had made that concerning grinding noise again on the way to work, and Sarah had whispered a small prayer that it would hold together long enough for her to save enough money for repairs. The car was her lifeline to the treatment center, to work, to her children's lives. Without it, the delicate balance she had constructed would collapse entirely. The dealership floor was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. Sarah's colleagues, most of whom came from families with connections in the automotive industry, often made subtle comments about her background. She was the outsider, the single mother who had landed the job through pure determination rather than family connections. They didn't know about her previous career as a bank manager, which had ended abruptly when the cancer treatments began affecting her attendance. They saw only what she allowed them to see, a woman struggling to keep up. As Sarah organized the paperwork on her desk, she couldn't help but think about the conversation she'd had with her oncologist the previous week. Dr. Rodriguez had been gentle but direct about the next phase of treatment. The current chemotherapy wasn't working as effectively as they'd hoped. A more aggressive treatment plan would require her to take significant time off work, possibly several weeks at a time. The unspoken question hung between them. How could she afford to live without a steady income? If you're watching this story and feeling moved by Sarah's struggle, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world about how these stories of human resilience touch your hearts. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more inspiring tales like this one. The sound of expensive shoes clicking across the marble floor interrupted Sarah's thoughts. She looked up to see Robert Chen, the dealership's general manager, approaching her desk with an expression she had learned to recognize over the past 3 months. It was the look he wore when he was about to assign her to a task that others had declined, usually involving difficult customers or vehicles that had been sitting on the lot for months. "Miller," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we have a situation developing in the luxury section. The Hendersons have been looking at the Bentley for 2 hours, and Patricia says they're ready to walk if we can't come down on the price. I need you to take over the negotiation." Sarah nodded, grateful for any opportunity to prove herself, even if it meant dealing with notoriously difficult clients. She had learned that success in car sales required a delicate balance of persistence and genuine care for the customer's needs. Despite her physical struggles, she had managed to close several challenging deals in her short time at the dealership, earning grudging respect from some of her colleagues. As she gathered her materials and prepared to approach the Hendersons, Sarah noticed a commotion near the main entrance. 2 men in dark suits had entered, followed by someone she couldn't quite see from her position behind the partition. The energy in the showroom shifted perceptibly, with sales staff suddenly straightening their ties and smoothing their hair. "Oh my God," whispered Jennifer, one of the newer sales associates. "Is that who I think it is?" Sarah followed Jennifer's gaze toward the entrance and felt her breath catch. Even from a distance, the man's presence was unmistakable. Tall and lean, with silver hair neatly combed, and wearing a simple but well-tailored black shirt and jeans, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to attention, but not seeking it. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, was standing in their showroom. The legendary singer appeared to be alone, having dismissed his security detail at the entrance. He moved slowly through the showroom, hands clasped behind his back, examining the vehicles with the careful attention of someone who understood quality and craftsmanship. There was something almost humble about his demeanor, despite his obvious wealth and fame. Robert Chen materialized beside Sarah's desk, as if summoned by magic, his earlier stern expression replaced by an almost comical mixture of panic and excitement. "Miller, forget the Hendersons. I'm reassigning you to our special guest." He gestured toward George Strait with barely contained enthusiasm. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with curiosity. She had grown up listening to George Strait's music, as had most people in Texas. His songs had provided the soundtrack to countless family gatherings, road trips, and quiet evenings throughout her childhood. Her father, a mechanic who had passed away 5 years earlier, had been a devoted fan who claimed that George Strait was the only singer who truly understood the working man's heart. "Are you sure, Mr. Chen?" Sarah asked, suddenly aware of how tired she must look. "Maybe Patricia would be better suited for this kind of client." "Nonsense," Chen replied, though Sarah suspected his decision had more to do with the fact that Patricia was currently dealing with the Henderson situation than any confidence in Sarah's abilities. "You have excellent product knowledge, and you're not going to fawn all over him like some of the others might. Just treat him like any other customer who wants to buy a luxury vehicle." As Sarah walked across the showroom floor toward George Strait, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was somehow significant, though she couldn't explain why. The pain in her chest had momentarily receded, replaced by a strange sense of anticipation. She straightened her shoulders, summoned her most professional smile, and prepared to meet one of the most famous men in American music. George Strait turned as she approached, and Sarah was struck by the kindness in his eyes. Despite his legendary status, there was something approachable about him, an authenticity that made her initial nervousness begin to fade. "Good morning, Mr. Strait," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Miller. I understand you're interested in looking at some of our luxury vehicles today." He shook her hand with a firm but gentle grip, and Sarah noticed that he took a moment to really look at her, not in the evaluating way that some customers did, but with genuine attention. "Please just call me George," he said with the slight smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "I'm looking for something special for my wife. Our 50th wedding anniversary is coming up, and I want to surprise her with something she'll really love." The warmth in his voice when he mentioned his wife was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Envy, perhaps, for a love that had lasted 5 decades, or simply appreciation for the obvious devotion in his tone. 50 years, Sarah said, allowing genuine admiration to color her voice. "That's truly remarkable. Your wife must be an extraordinary woman." "She is," George replied, and for a moment his expression grew distant, as if he were seeing memories that only he could access. "She's been my anchor through everything. The good times and the—" He paused, seeming to catch himself before continuing. "Well, she deserves something beautiful." Sarah led him toward the luxury section of the showroom, where vehicles priced well into 6 figures gleamed under carefully positioned spotlights. As they walked, she found herself studying this man, who had sold over 70 million albums worldwide, but seemed more interested in discussing his wife than his own accomplishments. "What kind of vehicle does she currently drive?" Sarah asked, falling into the natural rhythm of discovery that made her effective at her job, despite her physical limitations. "Understanding her preferences will help us find something perfect." George chuckled softly. "Norma has been driving the same Suburban for 8 years, says it's comfortable and reliable, and she doesn't need anything fancy. But I've been watching her admire some of the newer luxury vehicles when we're out together. I think she'd enjoy something with a little more style, even if she'd never ask for it herself." As they reached the luxury section, Sarah began her presentation of a stunning pearl-white Cadillac Escalade, but she found herself struggling to maintain her usual enthusiasm. The pain medication was definitely wearing off, and she could feel that familiar weakness beginning to creep through her limbs. She gripped the door handle of the vehicle a little tighter than necessary, hoping to steady herself without drawing attention to her discomfort. George, however, seemed to notice everything. As Sarah explained the vehicle's features, highlighting the premium leather interior and advanced safety systems. She caught him watching her with concern rather than focusing on her sales presentation. When she paused to lean slightly against the car while discussing the navigation system, he stepped closer. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to taking care of others. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you might need to sit down for a moment." The kindness in his tone was Sarah's undoing. After months of pretending to be strong, of hiding her struggles from colleagues who seemed to be looking for any excuse to find her inadequate, the simple concern from this stranger broke through her carefully constructed defenses. Before she could stop herself, tears began to well up in her eyes. She looked around quickly, hoping that none of her colleagues were watching this moment of weakness, but George gently placed a hand on her arm. "Let's step outside for some fresh air," he suggested, guiding her toward a side exit that led to a small garden area the dealership maintained for customers. "Take your time." As they stepped into the October sunshine, Sarah felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her like a physical force. This man, this stranger who happened to be one of the most famous people in America, was showing her more compassion than she had received from anyone, except her children, in months. The moment stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. Sarah realized that she was standing at a crossroads, though she couldn't yet see all the paths that branched out from this single moment in time. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle breeze. "I don't usually break down in front of customers. It's just been a difficult year." George leaned against the brick wall of the building, his posture relaxed and patient. There was something in his demeanor that reminded Sarah of her father, that same quiet strength that made people feel safe enough to share their burdens. "Sometimes we all need a moment to catch our breath," he said simply. "Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it." Sarah looked at this man who had conquered the music world, who had filled stadiums with adoring fans for 40 years, and saw something she hadn't expected: genuine understanding. Not pity, not uncomfortable politeness, but real empathy. It was this recognition that finally broke down the last of her defenses. "I have cancer," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Breast cancer. I was diagnosed 13 months ago, and I've been fighting it ever since. I got this job 3 months ago after losing my previous position because of all the medical appointments and sick days. I have 2 children, and I'm raising them alone, and I'm terrified that I'm going to lose this job too because I can barely keep up some days." The confession hung in the air between them, and Sarah immediately regretted her honesty. What was she thinking, telling a complete stranger, a customer no less, about her personal struggles? George Strait had come here to buy a car for his wife, not to listen to a sales associate's problems, but instead of the awkward silence or uncomfortable retreat she expected, George stepped closer, his expression filled with compassion that seemed to come from a deep, personal understanding of pain. "How old are your children?" he asked quietly. "Emma is 8 and Michael is 10, Sarah replied, surprised by the question. "They're incredible kids. They've been so brave through all of this, more brave than I have been some days. Emma drew me pictures to take to my chemotherapy sessions, and Michael has been helping with household chores without being asked. They don't know how scared I am." George was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Sarah hadn't heard before. "We had a daughter," he said softly. "Jennifer. She was 13 when we lost her in a car accident back in 1986. She would have been about your age now." Sarah felt her breath catch. She had heard about the tragedy, of course. It had been major news in Texas when it happened, but the Strait family had kept their grief private, rarely speaking about the loss publicly. The pain in George's eyes as he mentioned his daughter was raw and immediate, as if the wound was still fresh after all these years. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, and meant it completely. "I can't imagine—" "Norma and I, we learned something from losing Jennifer," George continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We learned that life is fragile and precious, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is help someone else carry their burden when it gets too heavy." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months they weren't tears of despair. There was something healing in sharing her secret with someone who understood loss, someone who had faced unimaginable pain and somehow found a way to transform it into compassion. "Your car," George said suddenly, changing the subject. "What kind of car do you drive?" Sarah was puzzled by the question, but answered honestly. A 2008 Honda Civic. It's been reliable for the most part, but it's been having some mechanical issues lately. Last week it broke down on the way to one of my treatment appointments, and I had to call a taxi. I've been meaning to get it looked at, but between the medical bills and regular expenses, she trailed off, not wanting to sound like she was asking for sympathy. George nodded thoughtfully, then straightened up with the air of a man who had made a decision. "Let's go back inside," he said. "I still need to buy that car for Norma, and I have a feeling you're exactly the right person to help me choose something she'll love." As they walked back toward the showroom, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for the commission from what would undoubtedly be a substantial sale, but for something more intangible. This encounter had reminded her that kindness still existed in the world, that sometimes strangers could offer more comfort than friends, and that sharing her burden hadn't made her weaker, but somehow stronger. Robert Chen appeared the moment they re-entered the building, his expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed anxiety. "Is everything all right?" he asked, directing the question primarily to George, while glancing at Sarah with obvious concern about her red-rimmed eyes. "Everything's fine," George replied smoothly. "Sarah was just giving me some detailed information about the vehicles. She's very knowledgeable. I think we're ready to make a decision." Sarah led George back to the luxury section, but this time her step had more confidence. The pain was still there, the exhaustion hadn't magically disappeared, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just a sick woman pretending to be whole. She was a person with a story, with struggles that mattered, with strength that had been acknowledged and respected. "Now," George said, examining the pearl-white Escalade with renewed focus, "tell me more about this one." Norma loves to drive her grandchildren around when they visit, so safety features are important, but she also deserves something that makes her feel special every time she gets behind the wheel. Sarah launched into a detailed presentation of the vehicle's features, but this time her enthusiasm was genuine, rather than forced. She explained the advanced collision avoidance system, the premium sound system, the heated and cooled seats that would provide comfort during Texas summers and the occasional cold winter day. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and making comments that showed he was truly focused on finding something his wife would treasure. "The leather interior is beautiful," he noted, running his hand along the smooth surface of the driver's seat. "Norma always says she doesn't need luxury, but I've seen how she smiles when she's in a comfortable, well-made vehicle. After 50 years of putting everyone else first, she deserves to feel pampered." As they discussed options and features, Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the interaction. George was the kind of customer every sales associate dreamed of, knowledgeable, decisive, and clearly motivated by love rather than ego. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove his wealth. He simply wanted to find the perfect gift for the woman who had shared his life for half a century. "I think this is the one," George said finally, stepping back to admire the Escalade from a different angle. "It's elegant without being flashy, practical, but luxurious. Norma will love it, even if she protests about me spending too much money." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she began calculating the commission. This sale would provide a much-needed financial cushion, maybe enough to cover her next few medical appointments, without the stress of wondering how she would pay for them. But more than that, she felt proud to have helped this man find something special for his wife. "Excellent choice," she said, pulling out her tablet to begin the paperwork process. "Let's go to my desk and start getting everything arranged. I'll need to verify financing options and arrange for delivery." As they walked towards Sarah's desk, she noticed several of her colleagues watching with obvious envy and curiosity. Landing a sale to George Strait would be the kind of achievement that would be discussed in the dealership for months. But Sarah found that the attention bothered her less than it might have earlier that morning. Something about her conversation with George had reminded her of her own worth, her own strength. The paperwork process went smoothly, with George providing the necessary information and making decisions quickly and confidently. He chose the highest-end package available, adding features that brought the total price to just over $90,000. For Sarah, the commission would be substantial, more money than she had seen at one time since her diagnosis. But as George signed the final documents, he looked up at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I have one more question," he said. "What color is your Honda Civic?" Sarah was puzzled by the seemingly random question, but answered anyway. "It's silver." "Well, it was silver when I bought it, Now it's more of a faded grey with some rust spots around the wheel wells. George nodded as if this information was somehow significant, then reached for his phone. "Excuse me for just a moment," he said, stepping away from the desk to make a call. Sarah busied herself with organizing the paperwork, but she couldn't help overhearing fragments of George's conversation. He was speaking quietly, but she caught phrases like "same dealership" and "within the hour" and "separate transaction." When George returned to the desk, his expression was businesslike, but Sarah thought she detected a hint of something that might have been excitement or anticipation. "I need to ask another favor," he said. "My wife mentioned that she might want to test drive a few different options before making her final decision. Would it be possible to have a second vehicle available for comparison? Maybe something similar to this Escalade, but in a different color?" Sarah was surprised by the request, as George had seemed quite certain about his choice, but customer service was paramount in luxury sales. "Of course," she replied. "What color were you thinking? We have a beautiful black Escalade with very similar features, and I believe there's a dark blue one that just arrived yesterday." "Actually," George said, "I was thinking something in silver. Do you have anything available in silver?" At that moment, Sarah's colleague Jennifer approached the desk with a clipboard and an expression of barely concealed excitement. "Mr. Chen asked me to inform you that a second Escalade just arrived from our sister location. Same model year, same features, but in metallic silver. It should be on the lot within 15 minutes. George smiled, but there was something in his expression that Sarah couldn't interpret. "Perfect," he said. "Would you mind if we took a look at that one as well? I want to make sure we have all the options before making a final decision." Sarah agreed, though she was beginning to feel confused by the sudden complication of what had seemed like a straightforward sale. But George was the customer, and if he wanted to compare vehicles, she would accommodate his wishes. The commission would be the same regardless of which car he ultimately chose. As they waited for the silver Escalade to arrive, George asked Sarah more questions about her children, her previous work experience, and her plans for the future. His interest seemed genuine rather than polite, and Sarah found herself opening up about her hopes and fears in a way that surprised her. There was something about this man that made conversation feel natural and comfortable, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. When the silver Escalade finally arrived and was positioned next to the pearl white one, George examined both vehicles carefully, walking around them and comparing features as if making a genuinely difficult decision. Sarah provided information about both options, though she privately thought the exercise was somewhat unnecessary, given how pleased he had seemed with his original choice. "You know what?" George said finally. "I think I'm going to take both of them." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. 2 luxury Escalades represented nearly $200,000 in sales, a commission that would change her life dramatically. But something in George's tone suggested this wasn't simply an impulsive decision by a wealthy man with money to burn. "Both of them," Sarah repeated, wanting to make sure she had heard correctly. "The pearl white one and the silver one?" "That's right," George confirmed, his expression serious but kind. "The white one is perfect for Norma, just as we discussed. But I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about your car having mechanical problems, especially when you're trying to get to your medical appointments." Sarah felt her heart begin to race, but she couldn't allow herself to believe what his words seemed to be suggesting. "That would be impossible. Too generous, too much to hope for." "I don't understand," she said quietly. George looked around the showroom, noting that several of Sarah's colleagues were watching their interaction with obvious curiosity. He lowered his voice and leaned closer to her desk. "The silver Escalade isn't really for my wife to test drive," he said. "It's for you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of her desk, feeling dizzy and overwhelmed. "Mr. Straight, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept something like that." "It's too much." George held up a hand to stop her protests. "Let me tell you something about accepting help," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "When Norma and I lost Jennifer, we were drowning in grief. We thought we had to carry that burden alone, that accepting support from others somehow diminished our love for her or made us weak. It took us years to understand that allowing people to help us wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a gift we could give to those who cared about us." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but she fought to maintain her composure in the public setting of the showroom. "I still don't understand why you would do this for someone you just met." "Because," George said, Sometimes God puts people in our path for reasons we don't immediately understand. You reminded me today of something I learned a long time ago, but sometimes forget, that we're all connected in ways that aren't always obvious. Your courage in fighting your illness while raising 2 children alone, your determination to provide for them despite everything you're going through, that reminds me of the best parts of humanity. George paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. After we lost Jennifer, Norma and I made a promise to each other. We promised that whenever we encountered someone who was struggling, someone who needed help but was too proud or too afraid to ask for it, we would find a way to extend a hand, not for recognition or praise, but because Jennifer would have wanted us to. Sarah was crying openly now, no longer caring who might be watching. The generosity of the gesture was overwhelming, but it was the reasoning behind it that truly moved her. This wasn't charity from a wealthy celebrity trying to ease his conscience. This was a deeply personal act of compassion, rooted in love and loss, and the desire to honor a daughter's memory. "How do I even begin to thank you for something like this?" Sarah whispered. "You don't need to thank me," George replied. "You just need to promise me that when you're healthy again, when your children are grown and successful, and when you encounter someone else who's struggling the way you are now, you'll remember this moment and find a way to help them too." Before Sarah could respond, Robert Chen appeared at her desk, his expression a mixture of excitement and confusion. "Sarah, I need to understand what's happening here. Are we processing 2 separate sales, or is this one transaction? The financing department needs clarification." George stood up, his demeanor shifting slightly as he addressed the manager. "2 separate transactions," he said firmly. "The pearl white Escalade will be registered to my wife, Norma Straight. The silver one will be registered to Ms. Miller here." Chen's eyes widened as he processed this information. "I see. And the financing for Ms. Miller's vehicle will be handled through my business account," George said without hesitation. Both vehicles paid in full. Sarah watched this exchange with a growing sense of unreality. This couldn't be happening. People didn't just walk into car dealerships and buy vehicles for complete strangers. But here was George Strait, one of the most successful entertainers in American history, calmly arranging to purchase a $90,000 car for a woman he had met less than 2 hours ago. Chen excused himself to coordinate with the financing department, leaving Sarah and George alone again. The showroom had grown busier as the day progressed, and Sarah was acutely aware of the attention their prolonged interaction was attracting. "I need you to understand something," George said, seeming to sense her discomfort with the public nature of their conversation. "This isn't about me being wealthy or famous. This is about recognizing a person of character who deserves better than the hand life has dealt her. Your children are lucky to have a mother who fights as hard as you do." "My children," Sarah said suddenly, a new wave of emotion washing over her. "I don't know how I'm going to explain this to them. They're going to think I'm making it up when I tell them about today." George smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him since their conversation began. "Children have a way of accepting miracles more easily than adults do," he said. "They might surprise you with how naturally they accept good fortune." As they waited for the paperwork to be finalized, George asked Sarah more about her treatment plan and prognosis. She found herself sharing details she hadn't discussed with anyone, except her medical team, talking about her fears and hopes with an openness that surprised her. George listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement when appropriate. "The hardest part," Sarah admitted, "isn't the physical pain or even the fear about my own future. It's watching my children try to be brave for my sake. Emma draws me pictures of flowers and writes little notes saying, 'Mommy is strong.' Michael has started doing laundry and making simple meals without being asked. They're growing up too fast because they feel like they need to take care of me." George nodded with understanding. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," he said, "but they're also more perceptive. They know when their parents are struggling, even when we try to hide it from them. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is allow them to help in age-appropriate ways. It makes them feel useful and needed instead of helpless." "Did you and Norma have other children?" Sarah asked gently, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "It's all right," George said. "We have a son, George Jr., who's been a blessing to us. But Jennifer was our first, and losing her, well, it changed everything about how we see the world. It made us more aware of how precious and fragile life is, but it also made us more determined to make our remaining time meaningful." The conversation was interrupted by Jennifer, Sarah's colleague. who approached with barely contained excitement. "Sarah, Mr. Chen needs both you and Mr. Straight in his office to finalize the paperwork. And Sarah," she added in a whisper, "everyone is talking about this. This is the biggest sale anyone has ever made on a single day." As they walked toward the manager's office, Sarah felt the weight of her colleagues' stares. By tomorrow, the story of George Straight buying 2 cars, one for a sales associate, would be all over the dealership. She worried about how the attention would affect her job, whether her colleagues would treat her differently, whether some would resent her extraordinary good fortune. George seemed to sense her anxiety. "Are you concerned about how this will affect your work relationships?" he asked quietly. "A little," Sarah admitted. "I don't want anyone to think I was asking for charity or that I somehow manipulated this situation. Let me handle that," George said, with a confidence that came from decades of managing public attention. "If anyone has questions about my motivations or your conduct, they can direct them to me." The next hour was spent in Robert Chen's office, signing documents and arranging details. George's business manager arrived to handle the financial aspects of both transactions, while Sarah found herself signing paperwork for a vehicle she still couldn't quite believe was going to be hers. During a brief lull in the proceedings, George excused himself to make a phone call. Sarah could hear him speaking quietly in the hallway, and when he returned, there was something different about his expression, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Sarah," he said, settling back into his chair, "I've been thinking about our conversation, about your treatment plan and the challenges you're facing with work schedules and medical appointments. I'd like to make another suggestion if you're open to hearing it." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by everything that had already happened, but curious about what else he might have in mind. "Norma and I would like to invite you and your children to dinner this weekend," George said. "Nothing formal, just a quiet meal at our home. We'd like to meet Emma and Michael, and there are some things we'd like to discuss with you about your treatment options." Sarah felt another wave of disbelief wash over her. "You want to invite us to your home? Mr. Straight, you've already done so much." "George," he corrected gently. "And yes, we'd like to have you over. Norma has been looking forward to meeting you ever since I called her during the paperwork process. She has some thoughts about support systems and resources that might be helpful during your treatment." Before Sarah could formulate a response, Robert Chen returned with the final documents. "Everything is completed," he announced with satisfaction. "Both vehicles are ready for delivery. The pearl white Escalade will be delivered to Mrs. Straight's address tomorrow morning, and the silver one is ready for Ms. Miller to drive home today." Sarah stared at the keys Chen placed in her hand, small pieces of metal that represented a complete transformation of her daily life. No more worrying about whether her car would start. No more anxiety about breakdowns on the way to medical appointments. No more explaining to her children why they couldn't go certain places because the car wasn't reliable. "There's one more thing," George said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. "This is the contact information for my personal physician, Dr. Martinez. He specializes in oncology and has been instrumental in treating several people close to our family. If you'd like a second opinion on your treatment plan, or if you ever need medical care that your current insurance doesn't cover, please don't hesitate to call him." Sarah took the card with trembling hands, reading the name and credentials of a doctor whose reputation she recognized even in her limited knowledge of cancer specialists. Dr. Martinez was considered one of the finest oncologists in Texas, the kind of physician whose waiting list was typically months long. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, looking up at George with an expression of gratitude so profound it seemed to encompass everything that had happened in the past few hours. "Say you'll join us for dinner on Saturday," George replied with a smile. "Say you'll let us be part of your support system during this difficult time. And say you'll remember, years from now when you're healthy and your children are grown, that sometimes the most important thing we can do is reach out to someone who needs help." As they prepared to leave Chen's office, Sarah realized that this day had become a turning point in her life, not just because of the material help she had received, but because of the reminder that human kindness and compassion still existed in unexpected places. She had entered the showroom that morning as a woman fighting a battle alone. She was leaving as someone who had found allies in the most unlikely circumstances. The silver Escalade waited for her in the parking lot, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like a symbol of hope and possibility. But more than the car, more than the financial relief it represented, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that she had encountered something rare and precious, the kind of generosity that transforms not just circumstances, but hearts. Saturday evening arrived with the gentle warmth of a Texas autumn, and Sarah found herself standing nervously on the front porch of a modest ranch-style home that was far more understated than she had expected. George and Norma Straight's house was beautiful, but not ostentatious, surrounded by well-maintained gardens and featuring the kind of comfortable, lived-in charm that spoke of a family who valued substance over show. Emma and Michael flanked Sarah on either side, both children dressed in their best clothes and unusually quiet. The drive to the Strait home in their new silver Escalade had been filled with excited chatter from the children who were still processing the remarkable turn their lives had taken. Emma had spent the morning drawing a thank-you card, featuring a stick-figure family standing next to a silver car, while Michael had researched George Strait's music career and was prepared with a list of thoughtful questions. The front door opened before Sarah could ring the bell, revealing a woman whose warmth and grace were immediately apparent. Norma Strait was petite and elegant, with silver hair styled simply and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of smiling. She was dressed casually in a soft blue sweater and jeans, but there was something regal about her bearing that spoke to decades of standing beside one of country music's greatest stars. "You must be Sarah," Norma said, extending both hands in welcome. "George has told me so much about you, and these beautiful children must be Emma and Michael." The children, who had been shy moments before, seemed immediately drawn to Norma's maternal warmth. Emma stepped forward first, presenting her carefully crafted thank-you card with the solemnity of a diplomat presenting official documents. "I made this for you and Mr. George," Emma said in her clear, 8-year-old voice. "Mommy said you were very kind to us, and I wanted you to know that we think you're special people." Norma accepted the card with genuine delight, studying the colorful drawing with the attention it deserved. "This is absolutely beautiful, Emma. I'm going to put this on our refrigerator where we can see it every day. Thank you so much." George appeared beside his wife, and Sarah was struck again by how different he seemed in his home environment. Here, away from the public eye, he was simply a man who loved his family and found joy in simple pleasures. He wore a comfortable flannel shirt and jeans, and his famous reserve seemed to melt away as he greeted the children. "Michael," George said, extending his hand to the boy, "your mother tells me you're quite the baseball player. I heard you made the All-Star team this year." Michael beamed with pride as he shook George's hand. "Yes, sir. I play shortstop. Mom says you used to play baseball too before you became a singer." "That's right," George confirmed. "I played in college, and I still love the game. Maybe after dinner, if it's all right with your mother, we could throw a ball around in the backyard." The evening progressed with the easy comfort of old friends rather than new acquaintances. Norma had prepared a meal of comfort foods that were clearly chosen with the children in mind: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread that filled the house with the aroma of home cooking. The dining room was warm and inviting, with family photos covering the walls and fresh flowers from Norma's garden adorning the table. During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally between topics both serious and light-hearted. Emma told elaborate stories about her second-grade class, while Michael demonstrated his knowledge of baseball statistics with the intensity of a sports broadcaster. George and Norma listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions and sharing their own stories in return. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The constant tension she carried about her health, her finances, and her children's future seemed to ease in the presence of this couple who had somehow decided to make her family's well-being their concern. But she also sensed that there was more to this dinner than simple hospitality, that George and Norma had specific things they wanted to discuss. As Norma served homemade apple pie for dessert, George cleared his throat gently. "Sarah, if you don't mind, Norma and I have been talking since our meeting earlier this week, and we have some things we'd like to share with you." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, though she couldn't imagine what else these generous people might have planned. "Of course," she said, glancing at her children, who were contentedly focused on their dessert. Norma reached across the table and placed her hand over Sarah's. "First, we want you to know that we've spoken with Dr. Martinez about your case. With your permission, he reviewed your medical records and consulted with your current oncologist. He believes there are some additional treatment options that might be beneficial, treatments that aren't covered by your current insurance, but that could significantly improve your prognosis." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. "I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I can afford." George held up a gentle hand. The cost isn't something you need to worry about. Norma and I have established a medical fund to cover all of your treatment expenses, including any experimental therapies or alternative treatments that Dr. Martinez recommends. Your only job is to focus on getting well." Sarah stared at them in disbelief. "You can't be serious. That could be hundreds of thousands of dollars." "Money is just a tool," Norma said quietly. "It's worthless unless it's used to make a difference in people's lives. We've been blessed with financial success, but that blessing only has meaning if we use it to help others." George leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "There's something else we want to discuss with you. We know that your current work schedule makes it difficult to attend all of your medical appointments, and that you've been worried about job security. We've spoken with Robert Chen at the dealership, and we've arranged for you to have a flexible schedule that accommodates all of your treatment needs. You'll receive full pay, regardless of the hours you're able to work." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of their generosity. "I don't understand why you're doing all of this for us. We're strangers to you." It was then that George's composure began to crack slightly. His voice became quieter, more emotional than Sarah had yet heard it. "You're not strangers," he said. "You're a mother fighting to live for her children, just like Jennifer would have been if she'd had the chance to grow up and have a family of her own." Norma reached for her husband's hand, and Sarah could see the pain that still lived in both of their faces when they spoke of their daughter. "When Jennifer died," Norma continued, "we felt like a part of our purpose died with her. It took us years to understand that honoring her memory meant finding ways to help other young mothers, other families facing challenges that seemed insurmountable." George stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking their backyard, his shoulders tense with emotion. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "Jennifer was 13 when we lost her, but she had already started talking about the kind of mother she wanted to be someday. She used to say she wanted to adopt children who needed homes, that she wanted to help families who were struggling." He turned back to face Sarah, and she was shocked to see tears openly streaming down his face. This was George Strait, the man who had performed for millions of people without ever showing such vulnerability, and he was crying in front of relative strangers because of the memory of his daughter and the connection he felt to Sarah's situation. "When I met you at the dealership," George continued, his voice breaking, "and you told me about fighting cancer while raising your children alone, it was like hearing Jennifer's voice reminding me of what she would have wanted us to do. You reminded me that she would have expected us to help, that she would have been disappointed if we had the power to make a difference and chose not to use it." The room fell silent, except for the quiet sound of George's tears. Emma and Michael, sensing the emotional weight of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it, sat quietly in their chairs. Sarah felt her own tears flowing freely as she witnessed this man's raw grief and love. Norma rose from her chair and went to her husband, placing a comforting arm around his waist. "George rarely talks about Jennifer publicly," she said to Sarah, "but your courage, your determination to fight for your children's future, it brought back all of his feelings about what kind of mother Jennifer would have been." Sarah stood up and approached George, her heart breaking for this man who had carried his grief with such dignity for so many years. "She would have been proud of what you're doing," Sarah said softly. "Any daughter would be proud to have parents who honor her memory by helping others." George nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he struggled to regain his composure. When he finally looked at Sarah again, his eyes were still wet with tears, but there was also a sense of peace there that hadn't been present before. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice steadier now. "Norma and I have decided to establish a foundation in Jennifer's name, specifically to help single mothers who are battling serious illnesses. You're going to be our first beneficiary, but we hope that in time we'll be able to help dozens of families facing similar challenges." Sarah felt the weight of this announcement settle over her. They weren't just helping her, they were creating something lasting, something that would extend Jennifer's legacy of compassion far beyond this single act of kindness. "We want you to be involved in the foundation," Norma added. "When you're healthy again, when your children are older and more independent, we'd like you to help us identify other families who need support. You understand what it's like to face these challenges in a way that we never could." Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention that children sometimes bring to moments they sense are important, suddenly spoke up. "Mommy, are you going to get better now?" Sarah knelt down beside her daughter's chair, taking Emma's small hands in her own. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I am going to get much better. Mr. George and Miss Norma are going to help us make sure I get the best medical care possible." Michael, not to be outdone by his younger sister, had his own question. "Does this mean we don't have to worry about money anymore?" The innocent directness of the question brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes, as she realized how much her financial stress had affected her children, despite her efforts to shield them from it. "No, baby," she said. "We don't have to worry about money anymore." George wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and returned to the table, his emotional vulnerability having somehow made him seem more human and accessible rather than less. "Michael," he said, "I believe I promised you we'd throw a baseball around after dinner. Are you still interested?" The boy's face lit up with excitement, and the heavy emotional moment was gently transformed into something lighter and more hopeful. As the family prepared to move outside for an impromptu baseball game, Sarah realized that this evening had marked not just the beginning of her recovery, but the birth of relationships that would last far beyond her illness. The foundation George and Norma were creating would become Jennifer's living memorial, a way for their daughter's spirit to continue touching lives decades after her death. And Sarah, who had walked into a car dealership just days before feeling alone and defeated, now found herself at the center of a new family, bound together not by blood but by shared compassion and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from medicine, but from the simple knowledge that someone cares enough to help carry your burden. 18 months later, Sarah stood in the sunny conference room of the Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation, reviewing applications from families across Texas who were facing circumstances similar to what hers had been. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now the person deciding who would receive the kind of life-changing help she had once desperately needed. Her hair had grown back fuller and shinier than before, and the healthy glow in her cheeks was evidence of a body that had successfully conquered cancer with the help of the finest medical care available. Dr. Martinez's aggressive treatment plan had been remarkably successful. The combination of cutting-edge immunotherapy and traditional treatments, all made possible by the fund George and Norma had established, had eliminated every trace of cancer from Sarah's body. Her most recent scans had been completely clear, and her oncologist had used the word cured for the first time since her diagnosis. Emma, now 10 years old, burst through the conference room door with the energy and confidence of a child who had watched her mother overcome impossible odds. "Mummy, Mr. George is here for the interview and he brought his guitar." Sarah smiled at her daughter's excitement. George had begun visiting the foundation office regularly, not for publicity or recognition, but because he genuinely enjoyed meeting the families they were helping. Today, a local news station was filming a feature story about the foundation's work, and George had agreed to a rare interview about the organization's mission. Michael, now 12 and showing signs of the young man he was becoming, appeared in the doorway behind his sister. "Mom, Mrs. Norma is showing the reporter around the Family Resource Center. She says to tell you they'll be ready for you in about 10 minutes. Sarah marveled at how much her children had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. The experience of watching their mother fight and win her battle with cancer had given them a maturity and empathy that set them apart from their peers. They volunteered at the foundation on weekends, helping with filing and organizing supplies for care packages, understanding in a way that many adults didn't, that their family's transformation had created a responsibility to help others. The foundation had grown beyond anything George and Norma had initially envisioned. What had started as a way to help one family had expanded to serve 43 families across Texas, providing medical funding, support services, and emotional resources to single mothers battling serious illnesses. Sarah had become the foundation's program director, using her experience to identify families who needed help and her background in banking to manage the financial aspects of their assistance. As Sarah gathered her files and prepared to join the interview, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The silver Escalade George had given her still sat in her driveway, but it was no longer her primary vehicle. The foundation had purchased a reliable van for her to use when visiting families across the state, and she had given the Escalade to her babysitter, Maria, a single grandmother who had been caring for Emma and Michael during Sarah's treatments and had become like family to them. The news crew had set up their cameras in the foundation's main room, where comfortable chairs were arranged around a coffee table that displayed photo albums filled with pictures of the families they had helped. George sat relaxed in one of the chairs, his guitar resting against his knee, looking every bit the humble man Sarah had first met, rather than the country music legend the world knew him to be. Norma stood nearby, speaking with the reporter about the Foundation's services. At 71, she remained elegant and energetic, throwing herself into the Foundation's work with the passion of someone who had found her true calling. She had become like a mother to Sarah, offering guidance and support that went far beyond the Foundation's official mission. Sarah, the reporter, a woman in her 30s named Lisa Martinez, turned as Sarah entered the room. "We're ready for you. I understand you were the Foundation's first beneficiary, and now you're running the day-to-day operations." Sarah took her seat in the chair between George and Norma, feeling the comfort of their presence on either side of her. "That's right, Mr. and Mrs. Straight saved my life in more ways than one. Now I have the privilege of helping them extend that same kindness to other families." The interview began with basic questions about the Foundation's mission and services, but gradually moved into more personal territory. Sarah found herself sharing details about her diagnosis, her fears about leaving her children orphaned, and the day she met George at the car dealership. "Mr. Straight," Lisa said, turning to George, "this foundation represents a significant personal and financial commitment. What motivated you to create something this substantial?" George was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently picking at his guitar strings. When he spoke, his voice carried the same vulnerability Sarah had witnessed that first evening at his home. "My wife and I lost our daughter Jennifer when she was just 13 years old. For a long time we struggled with the question of how to honor her memory in a meaningful way. When I met Sarah, when I saw her courage and determination in the face of such overwhelming challenges, I realized that helping families like hers was what Jennifer would have wanted us to do." "Can you tell us about that first meeting?" Lisa asked. Sarah and George exchanged a look, and Sarah could see that he was giving her permission to share their story. "I was working as a car salesperson, trying to hide the fact that I had cancer, because I was afraid of losing another job. George came in to buy a car for his wife, and I was assigned to help him. I was having a particularly difficult day, and he noticed that something was wrong. What struck me about Sarah," George continued, "was that despite everything she was going through, she was still focused on doing her job well, still thinking about her children's needs before her own. That kind of strength and selflessness reminded me of the kind of person Jennifer was becoming before we lost her." Lisa leaned forward with interest. "I understand there was an emotional moment during your first meeting?" George nodded, his eyes growing distant. "Sarah told me about her situation, about raising her children alone while fighting cancer, and it connected to something deep inside me. I saw in her the kind of mother Jennifer might have become, and I realized that helping her was a way of honoring my daughter's memory. There was something else," Sarah added softly. "George shared with me about losing Jennifer, and I think that moment of mutual understanding changed both of our lives. It reminded me that even people who seem to have everything can carry deep pain, and it showed me that sometimes healing comes from helping others heal." The reporter was clearly moved by the story, but she pressed for more details. "Mr. Straight, I understand you not only purchased a car for Sarah, but also established a comprehensive support system for her family. That's an extraordinary level of generosity for someone you had just met." George picked up his guitar and strummed a few soft chords. A habit Sarah had learned was his way of processing emotion. "Sometimes you meet someone and you just know that helping them is the right thing to do. It wasn't about the money or the recognition. It was about recognizing that we're all connected, that we all have a responsibility to help each other when we can. And now the foundation has helped dozens of families," Lisa noted. "How do you select who receives assistance?" Sarah answered this question as it was her primary responsibility. "We look for single mothers who are facing serious medical challenges and who demonstrate the same kind of determination and character that George and Norma recognized in me. These are women who are fighting not just for their own lives, but for their children's futures. They're not looking for handouts, they're looking for a chance to survive and thrive." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with George playing several songs that had been inspired by the Foundation's work and the families they had encountered. His music had always been rooted in authentic human experience, but Sarah could hear a new depth of emotion in his performance that hadn't been there before their meeting. As the news crew packed up their equipment, Sarah found herself alone with George and Norma for a few minutes. Emma and Michael had returned to the resource center, where they were helping prepare care packages for newly diagnosed families. "You know," George said, settling back into his chair, "when I walked into that dealership 18 months ago, I thought I was just buying a car for Norma. I had no idea I was about to meet someone who would change our lives as much as we changed hers." Norma nodded in agreement. "Sarah, you've given us something we didn't even know we were missing. You've given us a way to feel like Jennifer's life and death had a purpose beyond our grief. This foundation, these families we're helping, they're all part of Jennifer's legacy now." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever they spoke about Jennifer. Over the months, she had come to understand that her relationship with George and Norma was as much about helping them heal from their loss as it was about her own recovery. "Jennifer would be so proud of what you've built," she said. "Every family we help, every child who gets to keep their mother because of your generosity, that's Jennifer's gift to the world." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the window as Emma and Michael worked alongside Foundation volunteers, their young lives already shaped by the understanding that they had a responsibility to help others in need. "There's something I want to tell you both," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "Next month marks 2 years since my diagnosis, and my doctor says I'm officially considered cured. But more than that, I'm pregnant." George and Norma stared at her in delighted shock. "Pregnant?" Norma exclaimed. "Sarah, that's wonderful. After everything your body has been through, Doctor Martinez says there's no medical reason I can't have a healthy pregnancy," Sarah continued, tears of joy streaming down her face. "And I've been thinking about names. If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Jennifer." The silence that followed was profound. George's eyes filled with tears for the second time since Sarah had known him, but these were tears of joy rather than grief. Norma reached over and took Sarah's hands in both of hers, her own tears flowing freely. "Jennifer," George repeated softly, as if testing how the name sounded in connection with new life rather than lost life. She would have loved that. As the afternoon sun streamed through the Foundation's windows, illuminating the photos of all the families they had helped, Sarah realized that their story had come full circle. What had begun as a chance encounter between a desperate woman and a compassionate stranger had evolved into something larger than any of them could have imagined. The car George had bought for her still served families in need, driven by Maria, as she transported children to medical appointments and provided support to overwhelmed mothers. The medical fund he had established had saved not just Sarah's life, but the lives of dozens of other women across Texas. The foundation they had created together had become a beacon of hope for families facing their darkest hours. But perhaps most importantly, their meeting had transformed grief into purpose, loss into legacy, and pain into the power to heal others. Jennifer Straight's name would live on, not just in her parents' memories, but in the lives of countless families who would survive and thrive because of the foundation created in her honor. As Sarah prepared to leave the office that evening, she paused to look at the framed photo on her desk. A picture of herself, George, Norma, Emma, and Michael, taken on the day the foundation had officially opened. They looked like what they had become, a family bound together not by blood but by love, loss, and the shared understanding that sometimes the most profound healing comes from reaching out to help someone else heal. The truth behind George Straight's gesture, the simple act of buying a car that had saved a life and changed the world for dozens of families, was that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest ripples of hope. And in a world that often seemed overwhelmed by darkness, the Jennifer Straight Memorial Foundation stood as proof that love, when translated into action, has the power to transform everything it touches.